Jim Shooter is a complicated and divisive figure, and we will never truly know what happened at Marvel. Too much contradiction. To some, he's a martyr, to others, a villain. However, under his editorial-in-chief reign, the company was creatively on top of its game. I'm not saying it was the best ever, but to pick one example, this was the golden age of the X-Men, with Chris Claremont and John Byrne producing the book's classic stories, like Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past. He worked to create an incentives program similar to royalties. DC was doing the same thing at this time. In fact, there were stories of how he tried to keep the creative people that were Marvel's lifeblood happy no matter what it took. He allowed greater latitude for artistic interpretation. For instance, a newcomer was bad-mouthed to Stan Lee, who came in wanting to know about this artist whose work was supposed to be terrible, but Shooter stood by the artist and insisted that Lee check it out for himself, who wound up approving of the work of this new fella, this John Byrne. At the same time, Shooter was known to be a bit of a micromanager. Some of it seemed to work well. He outlined how a Marvel story should work to ensure that there was a consistent structure in place. In others, however, he got a little obsessive. He had some art skills, he would use them on Valiant at times when they were short-handed, and laid out how he wanted the books to look, consistent panels and a lack of dynamic action. Ironically, Stan Lee and Joe Buscema would offer this as an example of what not to do in their book and video titled How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. This is where the disagreement comes in. Some editors insisted that Shooter dictated ridiculous points that had to be in every single story. Others insist that this is an exaggeration or a misrepresentation. Shooter was known to meddle, and this led to the exit of some popular Marvel talent. There existed a status at Marvel called writer-editor, for instance. What this means is that the writer is, in fact, their own editor. A rare and coveted position, it was almost always given to former editors-in-chief who returned to just writing the books, and thus considered to have such mastery they didn't require an editor. According to Shooter himself, this was an idea Stan Lee had started but in the end regretted upon seeing some of the work that was being delivered. Marv Wolfman, for instance, extremely talented. But according to Shooter, Stan found his unedited material nonsensical and unreadable. And the legendary Roy Thomas, he had some slipped dates due to his workload, while Shooter had been trying to keep books on a tight schedule. The editor-writer title was eventually written out of contracts, which was understandably taken as an insult, even though it's also understandable why it needed to be done. The John Byrne situation, however, would be one of the better-known departures. Byrne had been preparing to work on the Marvel Superman series, had even drawn a cover for the first issue that he would write and illustrate, and he was very disappointed when that deal fell through. He had moved on to Fantastic Four from X-Men while someone else was shopping around the idea of a book, X-Factor, which would take the fumbling New Defenders and turn it into a reunion of the original X-Men. However, Claremont had shipped Cyclops off to Alaska to raise a family with a clone of Jean Grey, who had perished at the end of Dark Phoenix. A move ordered by Shooter, actually, who felt that after what she did, the only reasonable ending would be for Jean Grey to die. Now, Cyclops would be dragged back and join Beast, Iceman, and Angel, and to replace Jean, Dazzler, a character who had been bouncing around the Marvel Universe a bit. But Byrne told Shooter of a plan to bring back the original Jean Grey, much to Claremont's annoyance. Jean's death may not have been his original plan, but he felt the story was the better for it, and that undoing that would cheapen it. He wasn't all too happy having it dictated from outside as well. He was handling the Uncanny X-Men and all its various offspring, like the Wolverine series. He was even more upset to learn that Byrne then wrote up a backstory for Jean that appeared in his Fantastic Four book, one which disagreed with Claremont's. As a peacekeeping gesture, Shooter had the 2 pages changed. Now Byrne was incensed by this tampering, and the guy who had once publicly announced that he was a company man and backed up both Marvel and Shooter in the wake of attacks by former Marvel employees, now he was joining in those very attacks. In the middle of that mess, DC had their Crisis on Infinite Earths that created a whole new DC universe, and the characters needed to be defined. John Byrne was given the chance to introduce the world to a brand new Superman, like he'd wanted to do back at Marvel. But he was becoming more paranoid that editorial comments were secretly coming from Shooter just to mess with him, punishment for taking that Superman gig. When Shooter was eventually fired, Byrne constructed a straw man made out of New Universe comics and burned Shooter in effigy. So, tyrant or victim, many more stories can describe what happened during his stewardship. But whatever the case, Shooter was fired by New World, only to look at coming back to actually buy Marvel himself. One of Marvel's on-again, off-again books was a series called What If?, a peek into the possibilities. What if Spider-Man's clone had lived? Asked one of the series' original run, speculating on what would have happened if the Jackal's copy of Spider-Man hadn't actually died during the confrontation that ended Gary Conway's run on Amazing Spider-Man. The issue explored how things would have been different in that particular case. Or another two-parter that explored if Dark Phoenix had been allowed to live. As we follow events that happened at Marvel, it's hard not to similarly ask what if. What would have happened if Jim Shooter and not Ron Perlman had bought the company? Despite all these conflicting stories of hero or villain, he is someone who clearly loved Marvel and its properties, and as Shooter showed with Valiant, was very hands-on with the creative side, whereas Perlman thought it was distasteful if someone suggested reading his own product. John Byrne had been running a number of projects, including taking over the Incredible Hulk, a conundrum. The Hulk was one of the flagship characters of Marvel, their only successful live-action series ever, even if it was substantially revamped for television, and had appeared in his own cartoon series to boot. Yet keeping a book about the Hulk interesting for a quarter-century was not easy, and it was a problem for Marvel, one that John Byrne was confident that he could solve. Byrne took over the book and introduced a new storyline, but with the politics going on, well, as I said, Byrne was convinced that Shooter was out to get him. So when he submitted a Hulk comic that was no panels, just 22 pages of full-page art, there were word bubbles, of course, it was still a comic and not a pinup. The editor rejected it, and Byrne was convinced that this was another Shooter plot, and so abruptly left. The series flailed about trying to find direction, including the Hulk suddenly emerging from a tank with more normal intelligence and colored gray rather than green. The very first issue actually had featured a gray Hulk instead of a green one. It was changed to green because of printing issues. So, with a gray Hulk, a Rick Jones Hulk, and various goofy antics going on that needed to be ironed out, Peter David was given the unenviable task of handling the writing, and a brand new self-taught artist was brought on board named Todd McFarlane. McFarlane seemed shaky at first, but soon his style came together and he was moved to the flagship title, Amazing Spider-Man, where, with David Michelinie, they introduced the hot new villain Venom, returned Spidey to the old red and blue costume, and impressed the hell out of everyone as the struggling book suddenly became a powerhouse again. At the same time, two other artists came under the wing of Carl Potts, Jim Lee and, apologies if I've mispronounced this name, Whilst Portatio. Potts felt that they had potential with just a bit of work and gave them assignments and books to help further develop their talent. Lee got to work on a second book for one of Marvel's now quite popular characters, Punisher's War Journal. Much like McFarlane's Hulk issue with a Wolverine cover reflecting the title character in his adamantium claws, Lee's image of Wolverine's claws piercing the skull shirt of Frank Castle was an instant hit. Both books would wind up being holy grails as hot early issues of great careers with the popular Wolverine character. Lee got to draw Wolverine even more when his temporary fill-in assignment on Uncanny X-Men became permanent. Mark Silvestri was also making a splash. This new post-Jim Shooter group of artists were given free rein and became extraordinarily popular with audiences. McFarlane's successor on Amazing Spider-Man, Eric Larson, was also popular to some, though his style clashed with his predecessor that some found him an inferior replacement. Also during this, Louise Simonson was partnered with a new artist on her book, New Mutants, a guy named Rob Liefeld. Liefeld is simultaneously extremely popular and actively loathed, another self-taught artist who became infamous for big guns, excessive pouches and pockets, and an insistence on drawing women like deformed sex mutants. To many, myself included, Rob Liefeld is the incarnation of all that is wrong with 90s comic books. If I learned that he was in fact a 12-year-old boy who asked a genie to make him a rich comic book creator, I would only nod and tell you everything finally makes sense, because Liefeld's entire portfolio seemed no more sophisticated than what kids in middle school were creating. Liefeld was impossible to parody because you could not get more ridiculous than what he was doing with actual sincerity. But his transformation of the rather sleepy New Mutants into a new series with his character, Cable, provided an audience growth that was only matched by Simonson's exasperation with her new partner, whom even his friend McFarlane publicly referred to as, quote, the idiot. Speaking of McFarlane, he was starting to feel restless again. While he was becoming rich, ultimately he was illustrating someone else's stories, not his own. He finally asked for the chance to write and draw his own book. This is where our what if comes in. With the success this new generation of young artists had, Shooter likely would have allowed the loose reins. He commented once that McFarlane's stuff pushed the envelope, but not enough to object to it, so I can see him making use of this fresh blood. Also, McFarlane recently published his 350 rejection letters on Facebook from when he was trying to break into the comics business. He made a special comment, and posted specifically, one from Jim Shooter which did offer words of encouragement, made suggestions on how to improve, and included a guide on how to help implement them. McFarlane said he appreciated that one, and others that took the time to try to help him become an artist. Point being, I think Shooter would have worked to keep McFarlane happy. But what he almost certainly would have done was what McFarlane himself suspected would happen when he asked for the chance to write. Get a chance to learn writing over on some minor title, maybe partnered with a patient editor to deal with the self-described asshole to help him learn the ropes. Maybe turn McFarlane into the next Frank Miller. Instead, what happened was McFarlane was offered his own brand new Spider-Man series, despite the fact that there were already 3 regular Spider-Man titles. This wasn't unique. When it was decided to split the X-Men team and have 2 main books, Uncanny X-Men and just plain X-Men, Bob Harris, who oversaw the X-Line, decided that Portacio would do the art for Uncanny and Lee the art for the new series, and both would come up with the plots. The writer would be responsible only for scripting whatever came through from them. Chris Claremont originally did this, despite it feeling like an indignity given his long history with the X-Men and its highest moments, only to be reduced to a mere word assembler. But the rate art would come in made things impossible, and he left. Liefeld's reboot of New Mutants as X-Force had a similar situation, working with Fabian Nicieza, who worked to channel Liefeld's diarrhea of ideas into a working book. This move furthered the ever-rising popularity of these artists and several others, hot artists getting to work with the most popular comic book characters, and it made a ridiculous amount of money, which is why it was allowed. In disputes between Simonson and Liefeld on New Mutants, Harris sided with Liefeld. But then one day, Liefeld overstepped himself and made a move that got a very nasty phone call from Harris, and things were set in motion. Things that I'll get into in part 3, Image Problem.